Welcome to NodeCast Explains. Let's talk about some numbers. 20 years, 159 Canadian lives lost, billions upon billions of dollars spent. We're talking about Canada's longest war. It was a mission that started with a promise of liberation and ended in a chaotic, desperate retreat. This is that story. A mission that truly reshaped our nation and, let's be honest, left behind a legacy of really tough, unanswered questions. What did we actually accomplish in Afghanistan, and what was the real cost?
All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we're going to jump back to the fall of 2001, when Canada answered the call to arms. Then, we'll step right into the dust and fire of Kandahar, where our soldiers came face to face with the brutal reality of a whole new kind of war. After that, we'll look at the ambitious dream of building a new Afghanistan from the ashes, and the stark, often disturbing truth our troops found on the ground. And finally, we're going to confront the ghosts of this war and ask the really hard questions about what it all meant.
So, let's set the scene. It's late 2001. The world is in shock, the Twin Towers have just fallen, and our closest ally, the United States, has declared a global war on terror. And Canada, well, as we've always done, we answer that call.
And you have to understand, this wasn't just some token gesture. This was a massive undertaking. Over 40,000 members of the Canadian Armed Forces would end up serving in Afghanistan. The scale of this commitment was absolutely historic, a national decision that would echo for an entire generation.
You know, at first, the mission was packaged in a way that was very familiar to Canadians. It was called Operation Apollo. And the whole idea was about restoring order, getting rid of a regime that was hiding terrorists, and helping establish stability. The thinking was, this is classic peacekeeping. We go in, we help stabilize things, and we hand it over. Not an open-ended, forever war.
But that initial hope, that idea of a clean, swift mission, it was about to collide head-on with the harsh reality of a country just torn apart by decades of war. By 2006, the mission entered a new and far, far more dangerous phase. In 2006, Canada took command in Kandahar province. Now this is key. This was the heartland of the Taliban. And a resurgent enemy meant the Canadian soldiers were suddenly fighting in these intense, conventional-style battles, like the incredibly fierce Operation Medusa. The mission in Kandahar was not peacekeeping anymore. It was war, plain and simple. So this is the crucial turning point. That promise of a stabilizing mission, it gave way to the brutal, grinding reality of counterinsurgency. Improvised explosive devices, IEDs, became the signature weapon of the enemy, and daily combat became the norm. This was a kind of fighting Canada hadn't seen since the Korean War. And this new reality, this new kind of war, it brought with it a cost that you can measure in three stark numbers. First, the human toll. 159 members of the Canadian Armed Forces lost their lives. And beyond that number, over 2,000 Canadian soldiers were wounded, many with injuries, both physical and psychological, that they are still carrying with them to this very day.
And finally, the financial cost. By 2011 alone, the Parliamentary Budget Officer figured the price tag was as high as $18.5 billion. That's a staggering investment of Canada's national treasure.
But the mission wasn't just about fighting. There was this whole other promise being made, both to Canadians and to the world, that we were going to help rebuild Afghanistan from the ground up. And, on paper, the accomplishments looked pretty significant. These were Canada's signature projects. Millions invested in the Dala Dam to help farmers, thousands of schools built, millions of kids immunized against polio. The official story was that we would leave behind a stable, functioning, and more prosperous Afghanistan. But while that was the story being told back home, the reality on the ground was, well, a lot more complicated, and frankly, a lot more disturbing. Canadian soldiers and their allies quickly realized they were fighting a war on two fronts, one against the Taliban and another against the corruption of the very state they were trying to build. And this slide just lays out the disconnect perfectly. The goal, a professional Afghan security force. The reality our troops had to work with every single day, a system drowning in corruption, drug addiction, and widespread human rights abuses. Afghan commanders claiming pay for ghost soldiers who didn't even exist. Illegal prisons. It was all part of the daily reality. This quote from an American Marine advisor, it just paints a devastating picture of the moral toll. I mean, can you imagine being a Canadian soldier sent there to bring order and justice, and you're forced to partner with people who are actively committing these horrible crimes? It's an impossible situation. It just wears on your soul. And the problems were just everywhere. Advisors saw Afghan police smoking heroin while on duty.
They saw soldiers they'd just trained defect to the Taliban, taking their weapons and their training with them. Commanders would just vanish for months, and often, coalition forces had to look the other way, to turn a blind eye to the corruption, just to maintain some fragile sense of security.
Back home in Canada, this growing gap between the official story and the grim reality was taking its toll. As you can see right here, the mission began with overwhelming support from Canadians. But as the casualties mounted, and these stories of corruption and futility started to trickle back, that support just evaporated. By 2011, a clear majority of Canadians were against the war.
So that brings us to the final chapter. How does this all end? Well, after Canada's main combat mission ended, a smaller training contingent stayed behind. But in the summer of 2021, the final act played out with a speed that just stunned the world.
After the final withdrawal of NATO forces, the Afghan government, and that national army, the very institutions that Canada and its allies spent 20 years and billions of dollars trying to build, they just melted away. The Taliban didn't just win a war, they basically walked back into Kabul almost unopposed. It was a stunning, total collapse.
So what about all those signature projects? This table shows the heartbreaking reality. Those fragile gains in girls' education, in healthcare, in democratic rights, the very things that were held up as the mission's greatest successes, they were almost immediately reversed or dismantled by the Taliban when they came back.
In the end, Canada's last military act was Operation Aegis, a frantic but successful evacuation of over 3,700 people from the chaos of Kabul. Today, Canada does not recognize the Taliban government. 20 years after we went there to remove them, they're back in power, and they remain a listed terrorist group under our own laws.
Which brings us right here to this final haunting question. After 2 decades of sacrifice, after 159 lives and billions of dollars, what does mission accomplished actually mean? Did this war fundamentally change Canada's role in the world? Did we trade our proud legacy as UN peacekeepers to become junior partners in a conflict that left everyone with more questions than answers? The books on Afghanistan might be closed, but for Canada, the real accounting, that feels like it's just beginning.